Okay, so we're going to talk about the Galbraith text today, the Affluent Society. It's a great text to have in our class. Not only is it very much on topic, but it closes a circle very satisfactorily because, of course, one of our first, I think, in fact, our first reading was Marshall Solon's The Original Affluent Society, which was a play on the title of the Galbraith text. That essay from Solon's, you may recall, was written in the late 1960s, which tells you how old the Galbraith text is, that it was already being referenced in the late 1960s by Marshall Solons. It was published, I think, in the 1950s, in fact, but has been continuously updated because the Affluent Society by Galbraith is it's a really important text in terms of how it lays out a certain reading of, we might say broadly, capitalism, because we're in this question of the market society that we call capitalism, but also this idea of what it is to be affluent. So the engagement that it has with the affluence that the capitalist mode of production has provided. So that's our task today. Before we do that, I want to give a brief summary of where we've traveled to get to this point. And I'm looking for my pen, which is here. So I hope you can see my whiteboard. I've put down a couple of things. Is that all? Just can I get a thumbs up from someone online to tell me that my screen is visible and all good? Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we started with Marx, right, in our Module 4 material. I remind you that the main framing of our Module 4 here is this question of coming out of the market for belief, is this notion of the belief that we've created for ourselves in this particular market form, right? The Polanyi idea of the market being disembedded from society and people being subordinated then to the market that is around us. I've made frequent reference to that subordination and what it means and the implications of that, the whole idea being that we cannot conceive of ourselves outside of a market context. And so the social expression, if you will, of our humanity, of our subjectivity, is informed by the market institution that's around us. And the basic sense that the way in which we conceive our lives flowing forward will be dictated by a market logic, right? The market will give us the job that we need to pay the wage that we want to earn, to buy the things that we'd like, etc., right? That's the idea of being subordinated to the market, which is fine. Markets can serve lots of functions, as we've seen in this class. The question that we're engaging with in this class, or at this moment in this Module 4, is when the market function seems to be problematic, as in, for example, by continuing to use the market in the way that we do, we are at the same time, say, for example, challenging or threatening the health of the ecosystem that we need to survive. Can we do anything about it? And the particular paradox or maybe dilemma that we're looking to address is the fact that even as we are watching day by day, year by year, the climate around us deteriorate purely as a consequence of the functioning of this market in which we all have belief. Yet at the same time, we've not seen any kind of meaningful or substantive political action, and by political I mean the kind of social action that would seem to be necessary in order for us better to preserve our society and preserve ourselves, preserve the lifestyles that we have. And so the question is why? And the simple answer, of course, is that market, those market forces, or the nature of that market, is so encompassing, it's very difficult for us to imagine something beyond it, right? That's the kind of psychology that we're thinking about here. So we're not casting any kind of moral blame. It's not a moral failing in this regard. It's really a systems level question that we're looking at. And so we're going to continue with that discussion today and then, of course, follow it up with our final readings in our next class, which will be our examination of the emergence of consumer credit, which, subsequent to this discussion, you'll see is critical, as well as the Schumpeterian challenge, we might say, to our capitalist selves. I broadly include all of us in that label. So we started our discussion by looking at Marx. We looked at the Communist Manifesto. We did so not for its ideology, but instead for its, we might call its history. The idea being that Marx, as a keen student of Hegel, had an understanding of what history does, what history means. History unfolds the very story of humanity itself, right? Tells a story of how we self-actualize, how we self-fulfill. And so there was Marx writing in the 1840s, extremely excited because he felt that not only was he witnessing history, but we had the opportunity to become, as it were, agents in our own history and thereby shape where we were going. And you may recall that for Marx, the outcome is not social or economic justice, but indeed the actualization of the humanity, to allow us to actualize ourselves in ways that we have never been allowed to actualize before, because, according to Marx, all of human history, at least all of civilized human history, civilized meaning once we've moved into some kind of political or economic society, has always been characterized by class antagonisms, the central feature of which has been the exploitation of one group by another group, and hence the unequal distribution that follows therefrom. So we saw that Marx analysis of class antagonism. We saw that for Marx, writing in the 1840s, that the revolution, or as it were, the fundamental collapse of the capitalist mode of production was not something that needed to be brought about externally, but would in fact be triggered internally as a result of the contradictions that capitalism includes within itself. So the whole idea of being a communist in the 19th century certainly was to help spur that revolution, but it wasn't something that needed to be, as it were, created, manufactured out of whole cloth. It was going to happen simply as a function of simply as a result of capitalism functioning. And the reason for that, as we saw, is that in this stark world, that this sort of simplistic division or the simplistic opposition, that Marx provides, bourgeoisie on the one side, proletarians on the other, that eventually a class consciousness would form inside those who are working for a wage, such that they would then be motivated to change the system, right? To put an end to their persistent exploitation. So we see this idea then of class antagonism being brought to the fore in Marx's analysis, and then the resolution of that class antagonism, the sort of material dialectical process, will lead to a classless society, but also a society of prosperity. Because don't forget that for Marx, it's not as if capitalism is a bad thing. Capitalism is a necessary thing. Not only does it simplify class struggle, but it, of course, also provides the basis for provides a basis for expanding prosperity for all people. It provides people with things that they never had access to before. That was evident even in Marx's own day in the 19th century. Of course, much more evident now, right? That the level of prosperity at the level of consumption has increased enormously. So we saw that in Marx, that idea of class antagonism. Last time we were together, we asked them the question, well, if Marx was so convinced that it was going to be an inevitable collapse of capitalism, where is it? How come we haven't had a true Marxist revolution of the kind predicted by Marx? And the answer is, well, he obviously got something pretty wrong. And we located then, as part of our discussion of Veblen, the idea that consciousness, how you feel, or what you're aware of, is clearly very, very important to this whole story. We saw that question of consciousness, which for Marx was extremely simple, a bunch of people getting up every day feeling increasingly exploited, simply is not consistent with historical reality. Even though in the most narrow definition, we can still divide the world up into bourgeois on one side, proletarian on the other, the idea of a proletarian revolutionary consciousness can hardly, I think, be detected in our modern context. And in fact, probably for the last 50 years or so, that notion of people demanding some sort of systemic change as a result of a perceived injustice in the system seems to have been sublimated by something else. And so we turned to Veblen for some clues as to what it was that had changed that psychology. And we noted that in addition to the many, many reforms that have taken place since Marx's day, putting limitations on working hours and age of work and universal education and all these other kinds of things that have made the average working life a lot more pleasant than it was back in the 1820s, 1830s, that on top of that, Veblen puts his finger on something very critical, which is that human beings, once we move into a civilized environment, embed within them a kind of aspirational mindset or aspirational mentality. Hence, Veblen's theory of the leisure class is not just a sociology of rich people, but really a sociology of all people. Veblen's argument, essentially boil it down, is that the presence of these rich people, people who are better than us, is important because it helps to shape the aspirations then that we have. And we saw then in his analysis that he doesn't locate an aspirational society inside of a capitalist mechanism, but instead sees it as a feature of human beings getting together in societies as a whole. As soon as we get together, as we've already explored in great detail in this class, as soon as we see some kind of social organization, we typically see inequality. And that inequality, instead of being the basis for anger and resentment and a desire to overthrow the system, more often expresses itself as aspirational, or as an aspirational goal for other members of that society. So when we looked at Veblen, we saw that the Marxist class antagonisms can be sublimated by what we might call class aspirations. When you see somebody who is wealthier than you, instead of creating resentment, it creates that idea of invidious comparison. You may remember his language. And the invidious comparison means that you now rank yourself in terms of people that you see above you, but instead of making you want to overthrow the system, instead you want to become like them. And the critical word that he uses is emulation. If you may recall that word, the idea of emulation. So we emulate, right? We try to be like those who we perceive to be above us. And the other, one of the key ideas that we saw then in Veblen is that when we emulate, right, the people that we're emulating are not the people at the very top. That the process of emulation, or we might say the mindset of aspiration, has gradations to it. So the aspirations that we have is not with the richest of the rich, but instead with our neighbor, the person who has a slightly nicer car or a nicer house or something like this, right? So the important point there is that our aspirations can be expressed in ways that seem like they are within access, or that they're accessible to us, right? If I simply work a little harder or work a little better or work a little smarter, whatever it might be, I might be able to aspire to this next higher stage, right? So it's a kind of gradual element that's embedded in that aspirational model that Veblen points out. You may also remember that the key feature for Veblen's leisure class, writing in 1899, was that to be part of the leisure class meant you became a specialized consumer. And this will be important for our discussion today. So there is a specialized mode of consumption that attaches to being part of the upper class. And the chief characteristic that Veblen draws our attention to as part of that specialized consumption is it's a consumption of waste. You may remember his comments. I don't remember exactly if we discussed it last week, but in any event, if we didn't, you'll see it in chapter 4. He talks about becoming specialists of wasteful consumption. And the idea of wasteful consumption is consuming things that go beyond merely the utilitarian need, and instead you're consuming them for the value that they represent in terms of demonstrating your class status. So the best example, the example I've been using is, for instance, instead of buying an economy class ticket, you buy a business class ticket at a considerably higher price. The difference between your economy class seat and your business class seat, or the cost of the ticket, between those two seats, represents the specialized wasteful consumption. The purpose of flying business class is not just to have a more comfortable seat. It's also, as it were, to demonstrate your superiority, right? Your status, your rank. And that, broadly speaking, holds true for a whole class of goods that, as it were, embed within them a kind of waste. Any kind of luxury good, things like that, right? Things which are designed to go well beyond their mere utilitarian function in terms of what they do, to have a utility function that's about what they say, the story that they tell. And indeed, those classes of goods, Gucci bags and, expensive shoes and boutique vacations and business class tickets and all that stuff, we have a name for those. We call them Veblen goods, named after Thorsten Veblen. So goods that are created with a kind of artificial scarcity for the purpose of displaying or making manifest prestige. Economists call those Veblen goods in honor of Thorsten Veblen. So we've seen then that one of the things that happens inside of the system is that instead of class antagonism, we can see this process of class aspiration, right? That as capitalism or the Industrial Revolution progresses over the course of the 19th century and expands prosperity, even though there is still a very significant divide between the sort of small strata of wealthy people and the working poor, nonetheless, we can start to see elements of that aspirational mindset take shape inside of its capitalist context, expressed now as a function of what Veblen calls pecuniary emulation, the desire to emulate those who have wealth. Which leads us then to Galbraith, to continue our story along, because with Galbraith we're going to look at the question of the whole idea of class and the way in which class identity, I'm working class, he's upper class and so on, gets attenuated by a model of prosperity. I've put it here, class is attenuated through prosperity. Which is why, in this room, I suspect, almost nobody will self-identify as working class or upper class, but instead as middle class, right? It's that mechanism of prosperity that summoned up a new class identity, one that Marx could not have particularly anticipated, given the simplicity of his oppositional scheme. Workers on one side, owners of the means of production on the other. And now we have springing up a new class mindset, a new class psychology, which we would broadly consider a middle class. So Galbraith's text, The Affluent Society, another way of perhaps thinking about that text might be the emergence of the middle class, we might say. Now, in the text, Galbraith, writing in the 1950s, is essentially taking issue with many, what were at the time, standard modes of economic thinking and analysis. That's the primary goal of the text, is a kind of exercise in heterodox economics. And his overall or overarching goal in writing the text is to show, or to argue, that inside the model of affluence that wealthy industrialized nations have created for their citizens, there is a lurking paradox inside of that model, which for Galbraith is eventually unsustainable. And he is, in broad strokes, arguing that the discipline of economics has developed itself in such a way that it's papered over that central paradox. So the goal of his text is essentially to draw attention to what he sees as the logical fallacies of what was at the time current economic thinking in the 1950s and 60s. Some of his arguments seem a little bit dated at this point, in the sense that we've adjusted our thinking, but a lot of what he has to say, I think, still is remarkably apt, or at least, or maybe say, apposite to the situation that we're facing. In fact, I would argue that it's even more apposite in some ways than it was in the 1950s, because now we can take Galbraith's text and we can place it up against the reality that we are aware of, namely that continuing our existing model of consumption is being pursued at the expense of the health of our ecosystem, which is an existential bet, an existential bargain that you would think would provoke very fundamental questions. So I would say, if anything, Galbraith's text is even more relevant today than it was when he wrote it back in the 1950s, because the idea of sustainability is, I think, ever more urgent. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through his text and examine his argument. But I wanted to lay out broadly what he's saying. And this is almost as much for my benefit as for yours, so I can avoid the dreadful experience I had this morning and I remind myself of what it is I want to say. So instead of just saying a bunch of dumb shit, actually try and sound intelligent for a change. So broadly speaking, what we're going to see, you have in your reading pack, I think I've given you 4 or 5 or 6 chapters, I can't remember, they're all quite short. They're the middle part of the book. But I think they capture his argument broadly, his broad argument, very well, and give us an insight into the kinds of things that he wants us to pay attention to. So we're going to look at the first 2 parts of that we're going to examine is his discussion of why it is we might say why it is that Marx was wrong. That might be a simple shorthand for those first two things. But let's be a bit more formal. That insofar as capitalism creates, as a result of its functioning, these kinds of structural problems that Marx identified, namely concentrates wealth in the hands of the owners of means of production and systematizes economic insecurity for the worker who is part of that free market of labor. He addresses both of those questions, right? Basically asking, why is it that the problem of inequality and persistent economic insecurity, why have they not brought about some kind of massive change to the sort of market forces that are around us? Once he's dispensed with those two questions, and you'll see that we'll come to the point, you'll see that his essential argument is that the problem of inequality and the problem of economic insecurity are resolved through a form of affluence that's created inside of this market system. Once we've derived then this idea of affluence, we'll then turn and look at the last part of the discussion that we'll be reviewing, which is his discussion of the importance that production has taken on in our modern economic thinking, right? The important power of production. And in so doing, if I do it right, and there's absolutely no guarantee, I'm afraid, that I will do it right, but if I do it right, we'll be able to flesh out or explore in greater detail that key feature, at least as I see it, that key feature that I mentioned in our last lecture, namely that we've traveled a journey from the beginnings of this disembedded market from the 18th and early 19th century, which placed the emphasis on the wage laborer as alienated producer being exploited for gain by the owners of the means of production. We've moved away from that, and instead we've moved into what I would call a psychology of consumption, or put another way, we've moved away from seeing ourselves as producers and moved into seeing ourselves as consumers. And there's a fundamental difference between the two, particularly in the context of the system that we have, where to produce you go into a labor market and exchange your labor for a wage. Because when you're seeing yourself primarily as a producer, since, as we've explored extensively in this class, we have this mechanism of the alienation of production, that is to say that the social relations that exist inside labor disappear, right, and emerge instead as commodity and price. That therefore, a psychology of production is going to place the emphasis on the sense of the world around you being unfair, that you're being exploited, that you're creating value every day by going to work, but you're not seeing the true value of what it is that you're creating, right? That's the kind of basic idea that's there. Whereas once you start to see yourself as a consumer, it changes the whole rationale for the work that you're doing. You're not there to help drive profits for the man. Instead, you're exchanging your labor for a wage in order that you may then consume, right? This is the kind of idea that we have. So it places, and that de-alienates us in a way from our labor, because now it gives our labor a purpose. We're working in order that we may have a comfortable life, right? That kind of idea. And that's, broadly speaking, the mindset of, I'm sure, all of us here today in this room, because we now have broadly mainstreamed this idea of a consumer psychology. So the linchpin, or the fulcrum around that point, is then this idea of a society based on production. And that's what we'll be trying to explore in going through Galbraith's text. So it's going to be the same tedious stuff that we've done before, which is I'm going to pull up the text and we're going to read parts of it together, and it's going to feel very monastic, but there we go. The hope is that by going through together, you'll have a strong understanding of what it is that Galbraith is arguing, the things that he wants to say, for the purposes then of producing your own analysis. So let me stop sharing my screen on this one, and let me switch over to the actual text. So the chapters that you have are chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, from inequality to the dependence effect. I urge you, those of you who are interested in this topic, you should buy the book as a whole. It's easy to read, lots of good insights there. His walkthrough of sort of the early parts of economics is itself very, very interesting. He talks about Veblen, for example, in the first part of the book. Okay, so as promised, right, the first two chapters, the question about inequality and the question of economic security, or we might say economic insecurity, in these chapters 7 and 8, Galbraith addresses this fundamental question about why is it that a system that produces these kinds of unequal outcomes, why is that not more of a problem than it is? Now, we've seen already, of course, that all societies produce inequality, that in order to maintain equality inside of a society is pretty hard work, and you have to be a relatively small society in order to do it. So it's not like inequality is something new. It's not like before the Industrial Revolution there wasn't any equality. In fact, it was horrendous inequality. But there is a difference, which is that as part of the whole process of the Industrial Revolution, in addition to economic change, we've also had extraordinary political change. So we're the first, the last 200 years has been the first time that human beings, at least in the prosperous industrial parts of the world, have been able to assert democratic control over their own affairs. We get to choose, theoretically, which governments we want, which policies we'd like to have over us, right? So if we were collectively, for example, tomorrow to decide that rampant wealth inequality is a huge problem, we would do something about it democratically. We have that in our power. And indeed, that has been the case as a result of democratic politics. In 1946, after the Second World War, in Britain, where there was an extraordinary amount of inequality between the working poor and a rich industrial elite, the British government that came in after the war, it was a Labour government led by a guy named Clement Attlee. One of the things that they did was they raised the income tax to the extraordinary level of 146%. So they had people who were paying to the government more tax than they actually made as income. And you're like, wait, how can that be? And the answer is because is a kind of very almost violent gesture to arrest and reverse this problem of wealth inequality. What the British government required was that people submit or file all of their capital goods as if they were income. So if you had a house, you had to list it as income and then pay income tax based on the value of your house every year. Crazy. So the point was to introduce very aggressive measures to bring down wealth inequality. And it had that effect. Wealth inequality in Britain declined, as you can imagine, very dramatically. It also had some other bad effects. It didn't do wonders for the underlying British industrial base and so on. But we've seen then, all this to say, we've seen examples where through democratic action, we've taken drastic measures, drastic steps to address these fundamental issues of wealth inequality. Writing in the 1950s, it's actually curious that we see this from Galbraith in the 1950s because, in fact, in the United States, where Galbraith was based, although he was born in Canada, he spent his entire career in the U.S., the top marginal tax rate in the 1950s in the U.S. was something like 94%. So basically, the U.S. had a kind of salary cap. If you made more than a certain amount per year, everything went to the government. And that's happening at about the same time as Galbraith is writing this text. Let me take a little aside, because we're all BBA students, so this may be of interest to you. As part of that tax policy, it's curious. In 1950, I think it was 1952 or 54, under the Eisenhower administration, they raised the top marginal tax rate to this extraordinary level. And it didn't affect many people because it was because you had to earn quite a lot of money before you were affected by it. But one of the people it did affect were, of course, sort of senior executives at big corporations who were making fairly good salaries. And as a result, accountants, innovative people as they are, came up with a new way of paying business executives that skirted income tax. So it was a kind of a tax avoidance strategy for this group of people. Does anyone want to guess what the innovation was that accountants came up with in the 1950s as a response to the very high marginal tax rate?
Maybe you give the salary to another family member?
That would be particularly devious. No, it wasn't that. That's a good guess. Anyone want to guess what it was? Yeah?
Move the money out of the country.
That's also good, but to move the money out of the country, you first have to pay it to them, right? So it wasn't like you could just wire directly to the Cayman Islands. No, it wasn't tax evasion, which is illegal. It was tax avoidance. Well, they don't even call it tax avoidance. Those of you who are interested in a career, you call it tax efficiency. So it was a tax efficient solution. It was called a stock option. Instead of paying them with cash, they gave them the option to buy shares in the companies where they were working. And the idea of a stock option was that when you vested it, instead of counting as income, it counted as capital gain. And capital gain was taxed at a different rate. And to the point about moving stuff offshore, it's a perceptive comment because when you have a stock option that you haven't vested that's not worth very much, you can take it offshore and vest it at that moment as if you had vested it, and then cash it in later, and all of the proceeds will then count in that offshore jurisdiction. So you may hear sometimes arguments about stock options are necessary to incentivize leadership at the firm, and it gives people a stake in the system and so on. And some of that, who knows, that may even be true. But the reality is that the stock option was invented for purposes of tax efficiency when the U.S. government, in an attempt to redress problems of wealth inequality, raised the top marginal rate in the 1950s to over 90%. Just an interesting little aside. Okay, so this is the question then that Galbraith is asking in this chapter, which is why has this system, if not collapsed, undergone significant change based on the inequalities that it creates? Now let's remember that if we were to take a history of capitalism, that there is this shocking event, right, that takes place in the 1930s, the so-called Great Depression. You probably know the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression. The Great Depression was interpreted by many as revealing the fundamental flaws of capitalism when left unregulated. And a lot of the subsequent government, or a lot of the subsequent measures that governments have taken to regulate markets came out as a result of the Great Depression. This is not the place to get into the details of the Great Depression, but I'll put the dilemma very simply. If you make a whole bunch of people wage dependent in order to keep themselves alive, right, which is essentially the process that industrialization goes through, it makes people wage dependent. So the only way you can lead your life, put food on the table, etc., is if someone's out there willing to give you a job in exchange for your labor. You're not going to go back to the land and start growing your own carrots and turnips and stuff. So insofar as the system makes people dependent on the labor market for a wage, what then happens when that labor market disappears and there is no wage to be had? And this had happened frequently during the so-called business cycle. And the idea of a business cycle, which we think of as a universal feature, the business cycle was an unknown thing until industrialization, because it's a product of industrialization. So this had happened at various points in the business cycle. There had been points of depression or recession. But the Great Depression was, in this regard, unique, because never before had so many people, for such a long period of time, been unable to secure employment. And if the only way you can subsist is through securing employment for a wage, that represents, we might call, an existential, a structural, a systemic problem of the system that's around you. To give you a figure, in the United States, and this was broadly true in other countries as well, France, for example, and Great Britain, it's estimated that up to half the population was underemployed for a period of many years, 4, 5, 6 years, during the period of the Great Depression. There was outright unemployment that was about 25%, and there was underemployment that included up to 50% of the population. So this is why the Great Depression is this cataclysmic moment in terms of thinking about what is the capitalist mode of production, how do we want our markets to operate, and so on. And so, of course, during the 1930s, the role of government in people's lives changed very dramatically. And you can simply observe this if you look at government spending as a function of GDP before the Great Depression and after the Great Depression. In 1913, for example, in Great Britain, government expenditure as a percentage of GDP was under 10%. And almost all of it was on military, because this was the run-up to the First World War. By the 1940s, as the government had taken over, for example, the provisioning of health services to the entire population, had started providing for social security, so pensions, unemployment benefits and the like, government spending as a percentage of GDP climbed up into the 30s. So it's a 3, 4, 5, 6-fold increase And that increased role of government is a response then to the idea that people want to take care of themselves instead of having been left to the market. And how do we take care of ourselves? What's the institution that collectively takes care of us? It is, of course, government, right? It is our government. That's what we use to create collective goods. So it's in this context then that he's asking about this question of inequality, because of course in the 1930s, inequality had been much discussed as part of this larger debate about the future of capitalism. Indeed, I have to stress that in the 1930s, many people in what are now we would consider the wealthy, affluent, prosperous industrial nations, but many people in places like Great Britain and in France, certainly in Germany, in the United States, Canada, were very attracted to socialism or even communism as based on the idea that there was a fundamental need for an economic alternative to free market capitalism, which, having failed at its most basic task, being able to offer people a job in exchange for their labor, seemed to be in need of replacement. That disappears with the Second World War. The Second World War was a gigantic stimulus program, among other things. And so suddenly the chronic underemployment that had persisted in the 1930s disappears with the Second World War. Coming out of the Second World War, then there's this extraordinary several decades of advancing prosperity, most vigorous in the United States, but eventually moves to include Western Europe as part of its post-war reconstruction. Okay, so let's take a look at what he says about the question of, so the question is, why is inequality not an issue? Right, basically is the idea. And how come I can't move my text? Let's try this. So the first thing he argues in this is the idea of inequality itself inside of a system. Then we might ask the basic question, can you have a system where everybody is equal? Right, that's kind of the idea. Now, we know anthropologically the answer is no, because when we get a bunch of people together, in order to leverage the principle of cooperation, you need someone in charge. You need a manager of some kind, whether you call that manager a king or a chief or whatever it is. So we know that there is this basic principle that in order for us to benefit from cooperation, cooperation necessitates, not always, but typically necessitates inequality. So the first thing we can say is, well, inequality is just natural, right? That there's going to be a natural division between people based on that need. The second element is specific more to an industrial circumstance, which is in order to incentivize people to work hard, you can't have radical equality, right? You need inequality just in order to reflect the nature of the system. And this is what he points to here, is the idea that in the competitive society, and he cites Ricardo, and in case you don't know who Ricardo is, David Ricardo is a British economist. He's not as well known as Adam Smith, but he should be because he's more important, I think, than Adam Smith. Ricardo is the sort of founding figure of economics. He sort of saw himself as an economist, whereas Adam Smith saw himself as a philosopher. And Ricardo is the one who set out many of the basic principles that we still refer to. So you'll see his name frequently mentioned in the discipline of economics. So in the tradition of economics and descent from Ricardo, there was presumed to be a premium on efficiency. The competent entrepreneur and worker were automatically rewarded. The rest were punished for their incompetence or sloth. So this notion is that there's this idea that inequality is actually an expression of virtue, right? If you don't have very much money, it's because there's something wrong with you. And that's that kind of Veblen idea. And you can see then that this notion is that because of or that what links to inequality is the notion of hard work. Work hard and you'll do fine, right? You'll be prosperous. Well, of course, the 1930s put an end to that discussion. There were plenty of people willing to work hard, but if there's no job to be had, at that point, how can you continue to suggest that inequality is necessary? Instead, he says that there was, he divides this into a passive defense, but he also has what he calls a functional, or what you might call the active defense. He says the case for inequality became a good deal more functional. The undisturbed enjoyment of income was held to be essential as an incentive, the result of ingenuity. So this notion of we need to have a certain amount of inequality in our society to create incentives for people to go out and do the things, to deploy their creativity in order to succeed. But Galbraith doesn't buy that. He doesn't think that the reason there hasn't been a lot of chatter about inequality is because people recognize that it's necessary in order to serve as a motivation to do well. Instead, he notes, right, he says, there are few things more evident in modern social history than the decline of interest in inequality as an economic issue. For many years, no serious effort has been made to alter the present distribution of income. So we have, which again is a bit weird because he's writing in the 1950s, which is exactly when there had been these efforts to introduce income. But I think maybe he means at a broader scale. So the question is, why? Why have we not seen more aggressive efforts to introduce, say, for example, punitive taxation or extremely high inheritance taxes, these kinds of things, typical modes of wealth redistribution? He says the first reason inequality is faded as an issue is it has not been showing the expected tendency to promote violent reaction. And thus the Marxist prediction no longer inspires the same depth of fear. So one reason is that the rich are no longer afraid of the poor. They don't think that inequality is going to lead to revolution, so they themselves are not spearheading efforts to create a more redistributive society. He then points to the Veblen effect, right? Emulation or envy has long played a large role in the common view of human motivation. Envy almost certainly operates efficiently as regards near neighbors. It is not directed towards the distant rich. We've also seen this from Veblen. The individual whose own income is going up has no real reason to incur the opprobrium of this discussion. Why should he identify himself even remotely with soapbox orders and people who are discontented? But this is the more important part. Another reason for the decline of interest, the drastically altered political and social position, so that the role of the wealthy inside of society has become less visible. As you may recall that in Veblen's discussion, we have the idea of conspicuous leisure, making it clear to other people that you're better than they are because you have more money. That has declined. We observed that last time, the sociological change in terms of the behavior of the rich. In fact, our whole understanding of what represents the upper class has shifted away from an idle, landed elite, instead to imagine a world of crafty, creative, well-rewarded entrepreneurs. But most importantly, it's got to be down here somewhere, the real reason, I mean, all of those are absolutely true, but the main reason that Galbraith wants to focus on is in order for inequality to create a platform for action, you have to feel that inequality. You have to feel that somehow that you somehow personally or individually are affected by the inequality that is around you. The presence of a whole bunch of rich people that you can't see will not necessarily stir up in you that sense of inequality. When is it you're going to start to feel rampant inequality? It's not only that you have a bunch of rich people who have lots of stuff. It's when you have that, and then there you are with very little. That's when you start to see that sense of inequality. One of the things that may be worth paying attention to over the next couple of years, maybe decade or so, is when you see movements, as we saw in Paris and in Tel Aviv, here in Madrid and elsewhere, Wall Street, young people getting fed up and trying to sort of express themselves in what appears to be for older people like myself as idealistically, but I've always felt that's a bit patronizing. One of the reasons that they are doing it, right, what's a prime motivator is, for instance, the lack of affordable housing, the inability to buy a house. And that's the idea that my parents could buy a house, but I won't be able to afford one. This is the kind of basic good that the scarcity of which could potentially provoke a sense of serious disquiet, right? People get a bit fed up. And it's that kind of an idea that Galbraith points our attention to. He says, in a non-industrial environment, like he picks on, I don't know why he's picking on Chile here, but on Andean haciendas, it matters little to the man who works the land whether the product of that land increases or not. His own share is minute. An increase in product is not important if all but a minimum fraction goes to somebody else. So in this kind of a context, yes, you would expect to see some kind of worker consciousness emerge. But in advanced countries, increased production is an alternative to redistribution. This is the critical idea. Increased production is an alternative to redistribution. As indicated, it has been the great solvent of the tensions associated with inequality. Even though inequality persists, the awkward conflict which its correction implies, namely redistribution, can be avoided. How much better to concentrate on increasing output, a program on which both rich and poor can agree, since it benefits both of them. So, to Iria's concluding remarks, the decline in concern over inequality has been for a variety of reasons, but in one way or another, all of these reasons are related to the fact of increasing production. Production has eliminated the more acute tensions associated with inequality, and it has become evident to conservatives and liberals alike that increasing aggregate output is an alternative to redistribution or even to the reduction of inequality. The oldest and most agitated of social issues, if not resolved, is at least largely in abeyance, and the disputants have concentrated their attention instead on the goal of increased productivity. So I hope that's clear. It's not necessarily, you don't necessarily need to measure it in terms of the distance between, say, the top 10% and the bottom 10%, which would be a, say, classical tradition or classical method for evaluating or assessing wealth inequality or inequality effects inside of a society. Instead, you need to look at basically how much stuff people can acquire with what wealth they do have. And if you give them a mechanism to start acquiring more stuff, even though they are in a society that may be very unequal, they will not feel that inequality, right? They will not feel that inequality. And you'll see, and we're teasing our discussion as we go forward, but you'll see that the key element that we've introduced here is people are attenuating the sense of inequality through a mode of consumption, right? Consumption in this case, he's talking about production, we'll see how those are related, but consumption becomes important then to attenuate problems of inequality. So, as I've written here, increased productivity does not solve but can alleviate inequality considered as a social and political issue, forestalling the need for more radical, i.e. system-changing reforms, such as Marxism. Because the system is giving us the possibility to consume in a way that satisfies our consumer wants, therefore we're not going to sit there and say, as we did, as our grandparents did in the 1930s, maybe socialism is an effective alternative to the system that we have now. That kind of a mindset has almost entirely disappeared. Okay, so that's the first problem. The second issue was that of economic insecurity. So you may recall, let's go back to our Marx. Remember the problem inside of the capitalist mode of production that Marx puts his finger on. That's why his theory of innovation, that there is this constant need to revolutionize the means of production, might say to keep costs low. This means that labor, which represents a cost to business, is always going to be pressured by the desire to reduce costs as much as possible. No business wants to pay its workers more than they absolutely have to, not for reasons of some kind of moral failing or ethical turpitude, but because if they don't, they are unlikely to survive in a competitive marketplace. So for Marx, it was pretty straightforward. This is why the system itself couldn't survive. It traps people inside of a system which makes structural their immiseration, they're being reduced to misery as a result of the logic of the system itself. So why hasn't that happened? And the answer is because, and again, the Great Depression is very important in this as a historical event, that over the 100 years or so between Galbraith's book and Marx's book, the question of fundamental economic insecurity of people has been, to a degree, satisfactorily resolved. People do not feel as economically insecure in a modern affluent society as they did, say, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Part of this, of course, is the drive towards worker rights. And when Galbraith first wrote this text, for example, much larger numbers of the workforce in the Western world were unionized, and of course unions provide effective protections for working people. But the interesting thing that I draw your attention to in this chapter, which is I think well worth considering, particularly if you're studying business, because it's so obvious, but it's also kind of so counterintuitive, considering the way that we consume the sort of general idea of what it is that is our modern economic environment. We are trained, I think, or we are used to thinking that the government and the free market are antagonists, right? That the government represents an alternative to free markets. And indeed, we have a lot of language that's been produced by business associations and so on that emphasize the importance of unregulated markets, keep government out of the business of markets, that markets are best when they are left to do their own thing. The classic kind of Milton Friedman argument. And the interesting point that he makes, I draw your attention to this paragraph here. The elimination of economic insecurity from within the capitalist system was pioneered by the business firm, the corporation, in respect of its own operations. From the very beginning of modern capitalist society, businessmen have addressed themselves to the elimination or the mitigation of the source of insecurity, which is the competition and the free and unpredictable movement of competitive market prices, right? So business people have, from the beginning of modern capitalism, addressed themselves to the elimination or mitigation of competition and the free and unpredictable movement of competitive market prices. Monopoly, or the full control of supply and hence of price by a single firm, represents the ultimate security, but there are many very habitable halfway houses, price and production agreements or cartels, price fixing by law, restrictions on entry of new firms, protection by tariffs or quotas, and many other devices have all had the effect of mitigating the insecurity inherent in the competitive economy. Most important, where the number of firms is small, a characteristic feature of the modern industry, interdependence is recognized and respected, and firms stoutly avoid price behavior which would enhance uncertainty for all. So it's a key observation, right? It's a key observation that we think of the firm as emerging from the free market. That's what inspires the entrepreneur to express her creativity through business activity. Yet, once her idea is successful, what is that entrepreneur definitionally striving to achieve? And the answer is quite simply monopoly, to control the market. Any business that is not striving for monopoly is not a business that is well run, right? You don't want to have you want to always be able to do better than your competitors. You always want to have more customers. You always want to have more market share. And the best answer is to have no competitors and 100% market share, right? That's what all firms are striving for. Peter Thiel, do you know that guy? He founded some company, PayPal, I think. Anyway, some billionaire guy. He likes to say, you shouldn't even become an entrepreneur. You shouldn't even pursue an entrepreneurial idea unless you can foresee monopoly profits. Otherwise, it's not worth it, right? If you don't, that means like your idea should be a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon, right? All of which enjoy monopoly profits. So, what's Galbraith saying? He's saying that the problem of free market capitalism is you're there, you've got your business. There's always going to be someone around you who's going to try and take away your revenue stream, right? By setting themselves up as a competitor. Therefore, it's just a matter of self-interest. You will try to act or behave monopolistically. And our modern tech giant monopolies are very good examples of that. That is not always possible. So the next best thing is you get together with the other people who are in your market space and you say, right, let's cooperate, or the word that's usually used is let's collude, to ensure that the market situation that we enjoy remains stable. So we're not going to engage with each other in terms of price wars. We're going to respect each other's markets. You see a very good example of this in the United States. There are two cable companies in the United States. One controls the east half of the country, and the other controls the west half of the country. You see it also, for example, in supermarkets. Almost every European country, the supermarkets, the place you go for your daily groceries, is typically controlled by just a handful of very large firms who, broadly speaking, respect the prices of the other. They don't try and undercut each other on price. They simply try and attract customers based on store location. But there's this notion that they don't engage in these kinds of price wars. You also see that typically with airlines, which try to avoid engaging in that kind of predatory pricing, and so on. There's been lots of examples of cartelization, price fixing, et cetera, et cetera. Whole point about that is, from the point of view of from a businessman's perspective, let's say from a managerial perspective, that is your optimal strategy, right? Because your strategy is to keep your business alive and maximize its profits. How do you maximize its profits? By minimizing the risk. And so risk minimization becomes the optimal strategy, and the best form of risk minimization, of course, is to have no competitors at all and end up in monopoly position. So for Galbraith, I have to say, when he wrote this was a pretty provocative thing to say. But it was certainly not, he was not the first to say it, I have to be clear. So for Galbraith, the whole idea of the economic security or insecurity that seems to be created by the capitalist system can be mitigated by changing the capitalist system, right? So in this case, by thwarting the free market. And this is the curious counterintuitive element. Who do we trust? What institution do we look to in order to prevent monopolies from forming inside of our economic system? And for that, we require government, right? We see the monopoly as being against social goods because you can create monopoly rents. And so therefore, we ask that governments step in to prevent monopolies from happening. And we saw it happen with Microsoft. We've seen it happen in other instances. The European Union has an entire commission on monopolies. And so a way of thinking about that is, in order for us to have a free market, or some kind of a free market, we must have government regulation. A free market left to itself will move itself towards a non-free market, right? Towards a closed market. So this principle of economic security, pioneered by the corporate organizations inside of it, then extends to labor as well, right? And the key element of labor is the trade union. The trade union represents a form of security. It establishes tenure, basic wages, and so on and so forth. And so in a way, it's the same thing, right? They're just flip sides of the same coin. And I saw this, and it's an interesting example. You may have seen that recently there was an attempt to unionize at an Amazon warehouse somewhere. I don't remember where it was. And Amazon spent quite a lot of effort in order to convince its workers that they should not unionize. So did you see that last week when it was out there in the news? It's curious because Amazon has a near monopoly on online marketplace transactions. And so it's benefiting from monopoly rents in that regard. The workers that it hires, when they try to gain for themselves the same thing, monopoly rents, Amazon, the monopolist, spends a lot of effort to ensure that doesn't happen. But it's the same basic behaviors. It's a fun little example for us to consider. But so when Galbraith was writing, it's basically the idea of the trade unions are part of it, that trade unions create monopoly of labor. So just as businesses try to create monopoly of markets, trade unions create monopoly of labor, and that way you can grant yourself not only increased rents, but also greater security. But the other element that he points to is the fact that we've introduced a lot of measures paid for by taxes as part of redistribution to essentially alleviate the problems, the perils, the fear of losing your job or not having a job. Things like unemployment insurance or disability insurance, all those various social programs that we use to support people in the instance when they can no longer exchange their labor for a wage. And in sum, the benefits of those programs, at least as Galbraith would have us, so far outweigh the detriments, the downsides, that to call them into question would be an act of folly, because they've actually provided then the basis for us to live inside of the system with a peace and security that otherwise we would not have. As he mentions in this chapter, that in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people weren't worrying about an old age pension because they didn't expect to live to old age. They weren't worried about these kinds of things because the system itself was so precarious that they essentially internalized that precariousness into themselves. Now, on the other hand, we have a lot more stake in the system. So the very fact that we extend these kinds of benefits out and increase the overall level of economic security has made the system stronger and more robust, because now we are much more beholden to the system than we might have been, say, at the time that Marx was writing. I urge you to read this chapter for yourself and enjoy it. You'll see this idea of myth has played a part in concealing the effort of the modern corporation to minimize insecurity. Or another way of saying that is that There's a kind of mythology that's emerged to mask the fact that corporations are mostly risk minimizers and not value maximizers. And he has some fun stuff about that. 2 quick comments. The first is that since he wrote this text, this approach to the corporation has changed somewhat, because we now live in the era of shareholder value, and shareholder value has fundamentally transformed managerial priorities by essentially establishing a series of moral or fiduciary claims that says that the purpose of running a business is to maximize the value for its shareholders. If you have not yet encountered that in some of your other classes, I'm almost certain that you will soon. And this means then that when you go to work for a firm, you feel like you have this fiduciary obligation to make as much money as possible for the shareholders of the corporation, who are the owners of the corporation. And that has changed some of the internal strategies of the firm. If you're interested in that topic, I direct you to my online class, Critical Perspectives on Management, which is on the Coursera platform, and you can learn much more about all that there when I discuss it at great length. The second point I'll make is that this idea of monopolies in the 1930s was also part of this larger questioning about the value of capitalism. Here's the basic idea. If you have a system based on the capitalist mode of production, right, and you run the system, and the outcome is that in pretty much every business area, the optimal outcome is monopoly, is that good for society? And the theoretical answer to that is no, because the economic logic tells us as soon as you have a monopoly, meaning the consumer has no choice, at that point, the price that you're charging the consumer for the goods that they need is no longer efficient, because you're the only game in town. And this is what we call monopoly rents, right? Monopoly rents refers to the income that comes in above a certain price efficiency that would be established by a competitive market. And so this is why we've placed this kind of balance between monopoly rents versus perfectly competitive markets, right? Schumpeter, who we'll turn our attention to soon in this class, has a beautiful argument for why we shouldn't be too concerned about monopolies, which he gives us in his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And the Schumpeterian argument, well worth understanding, particularly if you're going to do a BBA degree, is that there's a big difference between being a monopoly and behaving like a monopoly. And that's, I think that's the critical distinction that he draws. And the reason there's a difference is because being a monopoly simply means you have these kinds of monopoly positions, right? You control the market. Behaving like a monopoly means that you use that power then in order to gain monopoly rents. And from the point of view of Schumpeter, the argument that he makes is capitalism is so robust. Schumpeter was a very ardent believer in capitalism. Capitalism is so robust that the point about operating inside of a competitive marketplace is even if you've managed to destroy all of your competition today, you can have no certainty that someone will not arrive tomorrow and take away your entire business model. Right? You might have a monopoly, for example, on selling blocks of ice to keep food cold. And then all of a sudden, someone's going to come along, and by virtue of their entrepreneurial ingenuity, they're going to come up with a refrigerator, and there goes your product. Right? So it doesn't matter that you're a monopolist in ice blocks if no one wants your product. Or, to draw an example closer to hand, you might have a monopoly position in hotels. As you know, the world's hotels are divided up between a few large corporations. And then some upstart comes along and says, hey, here's an app. Everyone can be their own hotel. It's called Airbnb. And now all of a sudden, your monopoly, the value of your monopoly, is not worth very much. This process, well, as a result, Schumpeter argues that monopolists in a capitalist economy have no incentive to act like monopolists because they never know when the next market-changing technology or idea is going to come along, and therefore they have an incentive to act as if they were in a competitive environment. And this process he calls creative destruction, which is the destruction of existing business models or existing revenue streams as a result of the creativity that capitalism, and capitalism alone, in his view, can leverage. And we have turned that idea into something we call disruptive innovation. There was a fellow named Clayton Christensen who was a professor at Harvard Business School. He wrote a book in which he took Schumpeter's idea, formalized it, didn't even formalize it, he dumbed it down a bit, and it came out as the concept of disruptive innovation. And if you want, you can go read Christensen's famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma. So all this to say that the presence of monopoly, the fact that businesses, well-run businesses, will always tend to monopoly, shouldn't necessarily be too concerning. And indeed, Galbraith does not draw a lot of concern from it at an economic level. Instead, it's quite the reverse. It creates security, and that's what we want. It's worth noting that the countries which have, on whatever index you'd like to choose, but say Western European countries which have, say, overall high rates of prosperity as measured by these various indices, UN Happiness Index and so on, typically like, for example, Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, places like that, are characterized by very low rates of entrepreneurship. Indeed, they have the rates of the highest concentration of employment in large firms. What's a great reason to go work at a large firm? You simply disappear into the firm, and it gives you a kind of tenure, right? It gives you a lot of security. If you go work at one of these big companies like AstraZeneca, well, maybe not AstraZeneca, depending on how its vaccine turns out, but I don't know, General Motors or something like that, Fiat. The idea is that this large corporation provides a security to its employees, right, because of the security that it's able to gain for itself. Whereas if you go look at countries that have the highest level of entrepreneurial activity, like countries like Colombia, where something like 2/3 of the workforce is entrepreneurial, it's attendant with a great deal of economic insecurity. So what I'm saying is there's an inverse relationship, as Galbraith is pointing out. There's an inverse relationship between people's perception of their own economic security and the degree to which employment is concentrated in the hands of monopolists or quasi-monopolists inside of the economy, right? And this then has made the system of capitalism much more tolerable for the people who live inside of it. Even though that seems counterintuitive because we're being taught to think of, entrepreneurialism is good and monopolists are bad and so on. But it provides these kinds of fundamental benefits, right? So all this to say, that's the reason why we haven't seen a major systemic change as a result of economic insecurity, because that economic insecurity is being sublimated away by the functioning of the system itself, pioneered by the profit motive that we find inside of the corporation, right? So if it weren't for the desire to pursue profits, we would not have found necessarily a way to solve this fundamental problem. This is a good time, I think, to take a break. It's always a good time to take a break, don't we agree? Like, when is a bad time to take a break?